The wind came down from the Dakota hills with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if the storm itself bore a grudge against anything living. It screamed across the frozen prairie, driving snow horizontally through the darkness, burying fence lines, and erasing every landmark Edith Bower had learned to navigate by. Outside her cabin, the world had vanished into a howling whiteness that swallowed sound and sight alike. Inside, warmth was a fragile thing maintained only through constant vigilance. Edith fed another split log into the stone hearth, watching sparks dance upward into the chimney's throat. The fire cast wavering shadows across the log walls, across the rough honeyed table, where her supper cornbread and beans sat half-eaten and cold. She had lost her appetite hours ago, when the storm's violence had escalated from mere weather into something that felt like a siege. It was Christmas Eve, 1874, 3 years to the day since Conrad had last sat beside this fire, whittling those small birds from Burwood, his hands patient and sure. 3 years since Ghost Hollow had swallowed him and 11 other men. And 3 years since Edith had learned that grief was not a single blow, but a series of them, each anniversary cutting fresh. The small pine tree stood in the corner, her one concession to tradition, to memory, to the stubborn insistence that some things should not be surrendered, even when everything else had been taken. She had decorated it that morning, dried orange slices that glowed like stained glass when backlit by flame cranberries strung on thread, and Conrad's 3 carved birds, a chickie, a wren, a sparrow, each one perfect in its simplicity. 31 years old, a widow alone on the frontier's edge, where the nearest neighbor lived a full mile distant, that might as well have been 100 miles away for all the help they could offer when trouble came. And trouble Edith knew was always coming. The wind threw itself against the door with such force that the latch rattled. Edith stood wrapping Conrad's wool coat, still smelling faintly of him, of tobacco and sawdust around her shoulders. She needed more firewood from the pile outside, though the thought of opening that door into the storm's teeth made her hesitate. She had just lifted the latch when the door exploded inward. Snow and wind roared into the cabin with such violence that Edith stumbled backward, throwing up one arm to shield her face. Through the swirling whiteness, she saw them 2 figures dark against the pale fury of the blizzard. The man was tall and broad across the shoulders, dressed in fringed buckskin that hung heavy with ice and snow. A heavy buffalo robe and thick woolen blanket covered his chest and shoulders, the practical protection of a man who had ridden through many Dakota winters. His hair fell long and black past his shoulders, thick with frost, with only 2 small eagle feathers braided close to his ear, their tips stiff with ice as they swept back from his brow. His face was all angles, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes that held weariness and exhaustion in equal measure. Beside him stood a child, a girl no more than 7 or 8 years old, with 2 thick braids that hung stiff as frozen rope. She wore a doe-skin dress beneath a blanket that had been wrapped around her small shoulders, and her feet were bound in moccasins already crusted white with snow. But it was her face that caught Edith's breath. Those dark eyes, enormous in a face pinched with cold, were not looking at Edith at all. The child was staring past her into the cabin's warmth at the small glowing tree in the corner. The man's gaze met Edith's. He did not smile. He did not plead. He simply looked at her with an expression that conveyed both necessity and a kind of grim acceptance, as if he already knew what her answer would be, and had resigned himself to it. "The storm turned us from our path," he said. His English was clear, only slightly accented the words chosen with care. "My daughter, she is cold. We saw your light." Edith's heart hammered against her ribs. Her mind raced through the implications with the speed of long practice. This man was Lakota. There was a bounty on a Lakota warrior, $50 raised just last week to 75. The name whispered in Cedar Falls was Oha, the one who moves like smoke. The cattle thief, the savage who murdered good white men. Edith did not know if this man was that. Oh, Tekka. But she knew that if she sheltered him, she would be marked. Harry Kincaid controlled this valley with an iron fist wrapped in the veneer of respectability. He owned the largest ranch, held mortgages on half the businesses in town, and most critically controlled every line of communication that ran in or out of Cedar Falls. His nephew ran the telegraph office. His cousin drove the mail coach. Any letter Edith might try to send to the U.S. Marshal in Tin Cup, any telegram pleading for help or justice, would pass through Kincaid's hands first. He would read it, crumple it, burn it, and no one would ever know she had tried. She was alone here, truly alone. And the man standing in her doorway with snow melting into dark patches on his buckskin and exhaustion carved into every line of his face was asking her to make a choice that could cost her everything. Then the child moved. The girl took one tentative step forward, her gaze still fixed on the Christmas tree. Her small hand reached out, fingers trembling, whether from cold or wonder Edith could not tell, toward the nearest orange slice. The firelight passed through the dried fruit, making it glow like a tiny sun, and the child's breath caught audibly. Her lips parted. It was not fear on her face. It was something Edith had not seen in so long she had almost forgotten what it looked like. Wonder. Pure, uncomplicated wonder. In that moment, Edith made her choice. "Come in," she said, stepping back and pulling the door wide despite the wind's protest. "Quickly, both of you." The man moved first, his hand settling on the girl's shoulder to guide her over the threshold. The moment they were clear, Edith threw her weight against the door, forcing it shut against the gale, and dropped the heavy wooden bolt into place. The sudden silence, relative silence, for the wind still howled outside, felt almost shocking. When Edith turned, the girl had already crossed the room. She stood before the tree, her small body rigid with a kind of reverent stillness. Her hand hovered near one of the orange slices, but did not quite touch, as if she feared the beautiful thing might shatter under her fingers. The man, oh Tekka, if that was truly his name, watched his daughter with an expression that made Edith's chest tighten. It was unguarded in a way his earlier weariness had not been. Pain and love and a fierce, hopeless protectiveness all warred across his weathered features. From somewhere outside, muffled by the storm, but unmistakable, came the crack of a rifle shot. Then another, then silence. The child did not seem to hear. She was lost in her contemplation of the tree, of this strange and wondrous thing that had appeared in the wilderness, like a promise that beauty could still exist in a brutal world. But Edith heard, and so did O. Their eyes met across the small cabin, and in that shared glance was the understanding that the men of Cedar Falls were out there in the storm hunting, and they would not stop until they found what they sought, or until the storm buried them all. Edith had come to the Dakota Territory in the spring of 1871, with hope stitched into the seams of her traveling trunk and ambition carefully folded among her few good dresses. She and Conrad had seen the notice posted in a Milwaukee boarding house, black ink on cheap paper, promising honest work and fair wages at a silver mine called Ghost Hollow, 30 miles northeast of a settlement named Cedar Falls. "We can build something there," Conrad said, his accent still thick with the German of their childhood. "Something that belongs to us." Edith, who had learned caution young and had been made more cautious still by their hard years in Milwaukee, had studied the notice with skepticism. But Conrad's eyes had held such certainty, such need to believe that their fortunes could change, that she had folded her doubts away and helped him pack. They had built the cabin themselves that first summer, cutting logs from the stand of cottonwoods along the creek and hauling them one by one. Conrad, who had trained as a carpenter in the old country before poverty had driven them across the ocean, had chinked the walls with clay, and horsehair had built a sound roof that shed rain, and snow had crafted a door that hung true on its leather hinges. Edith had sewn flour sack curtains and had made soap from lion lard. She had planted a kitchen garden and had learned which wild herbs could season their simple meals and which could bring down a fever. For 2 years they had lived simply and saved carefully. Conrad worked in the mine, descending each morning into the earth's dark throat and emerging each evening covered in rock dust, but with money in his pocket. Slowly, coin by coin, they had begun to believe the promise of that cheap paper notice. Then Ghost Hollow had collapsed. It had happened on a cold October morning in 1871. 12 men had gone down, not one had come back up alive. The official report delivered by a mine inspector, who collected his salary from the same investors who owned Ghost Hollow, had blamed interference by hostile elements. Evidence of native sabotage. The report claimed disturbed equipment tracks near the entrance that suggested deliberate malice. Edith had not believed it. The other widows had not believed it either. But belief, they learned, was a luxury afforded only to those who held power, and power in Cedar Falls was held by one man, Harry Connincade. Consincade had been the primary investor in Ghost Hollow. He owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory. He held mortgages on the general store, the blacksmith shop, the boarding house. His word carried the weight of law, because the nearest actual law, a U.S. Marshal, sat 2 days hard right away, in Tin Cup, and by the time any complaint could reach him, would have already shaped the story to his liking. The widows had received a pittance in compensation, barely enough to cover burial costs. Edith had sold Conrad's tools, his good winter coat, his pocket watch, all the small accumulations of their life together, to buy seed for spring planting. She had buried her husband in the churchyard with only 5 words spoken over him by a circuit preacher who mangled the pronunciation of his German name. 2 months later, Connincade had appeared at her door with a lawyer and a sheet of paper that claimed Conrad had died owing money. Equipment costs, supply advances, lodging fees at the mine. The debt, Cade explained with cold courtesy, now belonged to her. Edith had known it was a lie. Conrad had kept meticulous records in his neat German script, had noted every penny earned and every penny spent. He had owed no one, but Connincade had papers signed by witnesses who worked for him. And Edith had only a ledger written in a language no one in Cedar Falls could read, and a widow's word, which was worth less than the paper it might have been written on. Worse still, Connincade controlled everything that moved in or out of Cedar Falls. His nephew, Thomas Consincade, ran the telegraph office and read every message that came through. His cousin by marriage, Samuel Ducker, drove the twice-weekly mail coach and had been known to lose letters that contained complaints about Concade's business practices. There was no way to reach the outside world that did not pass through Concade's hands first. Edith was trapped as surely as if she had been locked in a cell. So, she had survived on the margins. She took in sewing, mending torn hems, and letting out waistbands for the town's more prosperous wives. She sold eggs when her hens were productive. She traded butter and cheese for flour and coffee. She kept her head down her door, bolted, and her thoughts to herself. But she was not entirely without allies. Dr. Hugo Mercer was the first. He was a thin, weary man in his middle 50s who had come west 5 years ago after losing his medical practice in St. Louis to debts incurred by drink. He had been sober since arriving in Cedar Falls, driven by some private penance Edith had never asked about. He ran the town's only medical office with a combination of skill and bone-deep exhaustion, and he trusted Edith's knowledge of herbal remedies. In return, Edith trusted him not to ask questions about where she had learned to set a broken bone or treat a fever. Grace Whitmore was the second ally. She was the town's schoolteacher, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s who had come from Boston with both idealism and desperation in her carpetbag. She believed, against considerable evidence to the contrary, that education could civilize the frontier. More dangerously, she believed that Lakota children deserved to sit in her classroom alongside white children, a position that made her an object of suspicion and periodic hostility. The third was Catherine Brennan, though everyone called her Kind Kate, a nickname that was used with varying degrees of irony depending on who spoke it. Kate ran the saloon on Front Street. She was 45, red-haired, foul-mouthed when provoked, and sharp as any skinning knife. She heard everything men said after their third whiskey, and remembered all of it with perfect clarity. She had once told Edith, in a rare moment of unguarded softness, that any woman who could survive what Edith had survived was tougher than half the men in town combined. These three, the doctor, the teacher, and the saloon keeper, formed the fragile network that kept Edith tethered to humanity. Without them, she might have drifted into the silence and isolation that claimed so many frontier widows, becoming a ghost long before death made it official. But now, standing in her cabin with an injured Lakota warrior and his daughter dripping snow melt onto her floor, Edith understood that even these allies might not be enough to protect her from what was coming. Uka had not moved from his position near the door. He stood with his back to the wall, his eyes on the window, watching for movement, for torches for the riders who would come eventually. His left arm hung awkwardly at his side, and Edith saw now what she had missed in the initial confusion and the torn buckskin dark with something that was not merely snowmelt. Blood. "You are hurt," she said. His eyes flicked to her, then away. "It is nothing. It is not nothing. Sit." "I cannot. You can, and you will." Edith said, her voice sharp with the authority of someone who had spent 3 years refusing to be cowed. "Sit down before you fall down, and let me see it." For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then the ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face there and gone in an instant, and he moved to the chair beside the fire. His movements were controlled, careful, the movements of someone accustomed to pain. Edith crossed to the stove and poured water from the kettle into a tin basin. She tore a strip of cloth from an old petticoat, one of the last pieces of her former life that still had any use, and dampened it. When she returned to Ohiteka's side, she found the girl watching with wide, solemn eyes. "What is your name?" Edith asked gently. The child hesitated, glancing at her father. He gave the smallest nod. "Ryan," the girl whispered. "Ryan," Edith repeated, letting the unfamiliar syllables settle on her tongue. "That is a beautiful name. I am Edith." Ryan said nothing, but her eyes remained fixed on Edith's face with an intensity that was unnerving and oddly moving at once. Edith turned her attention to Oteka's wound. She pushed aside the torn buckskin carefully. The bullet had carved a shallow furrow along the outside of his upper arm, just below the shoulder joint. Not deep enough to have struck bone, but ugly nonetheless. The flesh around it was inflamed and beginning to swell. "This needs to be cleaned," Edith said. "It will hurt. I have known pain before." "Oh," Teka replied quietly. Edith began to work. She cleaned the wound with careful thoroughness, her hands steady despite the tremor of fear that ran beneath her skin. Oh did not flinch. He did not make a sound. He simply sat, his jaw tight, his eyes distant while she worked. When she finished, she bound the arm with clean strips of cloth and tied it off. "You will need to change the dressing tomorrow," she said, "and the day after if infection sets in." "I know," O said. He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw not weariness, but something closer to gratitude. "Thank you," Edith nodded. She busied herself putting away the basin and the soiled cloth, aware that her hands were shaking now that the immediate task was complete. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the cabin walls. Inside, silence stretched between them, waited, with all the things that could not yet be said. Finally, Ryan spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why do you have a tree inside your house?" Edith turned. The girl was still standing before the decorated pine, her small face upturned, her expression caught between confusion and that earlier wonder. "It is for Christmas," Edith said. "A tradition from where I come from. We bring a tree inside and decorate it to celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "The hope that light will return," Edith said. Even in the darkest time of year, Ryan considered this. Then, very carefully, she reached out and touched one of the orange slices. Her fingers were gentle, reverent, as if she were touching something holy. Oh watched his daughter, and the expression on his face was so raw that Edith had to look away. She busied herself with the fire, adding another log, stirring the coals, anything to give him a moment of privacy for whatever emotion was moving through him. When she looked back, Ryan had settled onto the floor near the tree. Cross-legged, her blanket pulled around her shoulders. Her eyes were already growing heavy. "She has not slept in 2 days," Uka said quietly. "We have been moving, running," Edith corrected gently. He nodded. "From Harry Consincade's men." Another nod. "Did you steal his cattle?" Edith asked. The question was blunt, but she needed to know. Oh, Tekka's eyes met hers. "No. Then why does he hunt you?" "Because he needs someone to hunt," said, "and we are convenient." The simplicity of it, the terrible, exhausting simplicity, hung in the air between them. From outside came the sound of hoofbeats, distant but growing closer. Was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Edith crossed to the window and peered through the gap in the curtain. 6 riders, dark shapes against the white landscape. Leading them was a figure she recognized even at a distance. Harry Kincaid on his big sorrel gelding. "They are coming here," Edith said, hand tightened on his knife. "We will go, out the back." "No," Edith said. She turned from the window, her decision made. "You will stay, both of you, and I will handle this. They will search." "Let them," Edith said. She crossed to Ryan and gently shook the child awake. "Come, little one, quickly now into the loft." She guided the drowsy girl to the ladder and helped her climb to the small sleeping space above. Followed moving with surprising silence for a man of his size. Edith spread a quilt over them both, tucking the edges carefully. "Do not move," she whispered. "Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear." Ryan's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded. Edith climbed back down and pulled the ladder up behind her, leaning it against the wall as if it had not been used. She smoothed her skirts, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and crossed to the door just as the pounding began. She waited 3 heartbeats. Then she lifted the bolt and pulled the door open. Harry Consincade stood on her threshold, snow gathering on the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his heavy fur coat. Behind him, 5 men sat on horseback, their faces shadowed, their rifles conspicuous across their saddles. "Mrs. Bower," Consincade said. His voice was flat, businesslike, devoid of warmth. "Cold night to be awake." "I could say the same to you, Mr. Kincaid," Edith replied. She did not step aside to invite him in, but neither did she close the door. "What brings you out in this storm?" "Hunting," Consincade said. He studied her face with pale, unblinking eyes. "We are looking for a man, Lakota. Dangerous. He is wanted for cattle theft and murder. You have not seen anyone matching that description." "I have seen no one but my chickens all evening," Edith said evenly. and they are poor conversationalists. One of the men behind Consincade, a young ranch hand named Billy Hutchkins, snorted with barely suppressed laughter. Consincade's head turned slightly, and the laughter died as if cut with a blade. Another man pushed forward. He was lean and wiry, with a scar running from temple to jaw that gave his face a permanent sneer. Edith had seen him before, drinking in Kate's saloon, winning at cards with hands that moved just a little too quickly to be entirely honest. "Name's Pete," he said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it more menacing. "Pete Garson. Some folks call me Poison Pete. You know why?" "I do not," Edith said. "Got bit by a rattler once. Should have died." "Didn't." He smiled, showing teeth that were surprisingly white in his weathered face. "Means I'm lucky. And I got a nose for when folks are lying to me." "Then your nose must be very tired," Edith said, "from all the lies you hear in Kate's saloon." For a moment, Pete's smile faltered. Then he laughed a short barking sound. "She's got sand, Harry. I'll give her that." Concade's expression did not change. "We need to search your cabin, Mrs. Bower. Do you have a warrant?" "I do not need a warrant. I need cooperation, and I expect to receive it." It was not a request. Edith stepped aside. They entered like a small invasion force, Kincaid first, followed by Pete and Billy. The other three remained outside, holding the horses, blocking any escape. Edith stood by the open door arms, crossed face composed, while they tore through her small home. They overturned the mattress. They rifled through her sewing basket, scattering spools of thread and packets of needles. They opened every cupboard, looked under the table, checked behind the woodpile. Billy climbed onto a chair and pushed open the loft door, peering into the darkness above. Edith's heart stopped. She watched, not daring to breathe as Billy's head disappeared into the loft space. She heard him moving around, heard the rustle of quilts being shifted. "Please," she thought. "Please." Billy's head reappeared. He climbed down, shaking his head. Nothing up there but old blankets and mouse droppings. Edith's lungs resumed their function. Pete was standing by the stove, one hand resting on the butt of his revolver. His eyes were on the tin basin where Edith had cleaned O's wound. A faint pink stain still colored the water. "You've been doctoring someone, Mrs. Devour?" he asked mildly. "Myself," Edith said without hesitation. "Cut my hand while chopping wood yesterday." "Clumsy of me." Pete looked at her hands. Edith held them out. There was, in fact, a healing cut on her left palm, an old injury from 2 weeks ago, but he would not know that. Pete's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Consincade walked to the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in every detail. His gaze lingered on the Christmas tree, on the carved birds, on the orange slices glowing in the firelight. Something flickered across his face, contempt perhaps, or disdain for such foolish sentiment. "You live out here alone," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, dangerous for a woman. I manage." "Not many women would open their door on a night like this," Concaide continued, "not without knowing who stood on the other side." "I did not open it," Edith said. "You pounded until I had no choice." Consincade smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Careful, Mrs. Bower. You still owe me money. Conrad's debts came to you when he died. That gives me certain interests in your continued well-being. Interests that could be withdrawn if you become more trouble than you are worth." Edith met his eyes and did not flinch. "I have not forgotten the debt, Mr. Consincade, just as I have not forgotten that my husband kept perfect records and owed no one when he died." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Concade's smile faded. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, when Edith saw something cold and calculating move behind his eyes. Then he turned toward the door. "We are finished here for now. Pete was the last to leave. He paused on the threshold and looked back at her. "See you around, Mrs. Bower," he said softly. It sounded like a threat. Edith closed the door behind them and dropped the bolt. She stood there trembling now that the danger had passed, listening to the sound of hoofbeats fading into the storm. Only when silence had returned, relative silence for the wind still raged, did she cross to the wall and pull the ladder back into place. She climbed quickly. Oh, and Ryan lay beneath the quilt exactly as she had left them. Ryan was asleep, exhausted beyond the ability to stay wakeful even in the face of danger. But O's eyes were open, alert, his knife still clutched in his right hand. "They are gone," Edith whispered. O Tekka nodded. He did not release his grip on the knife. "You can come down now. You will be safe here tonight at least." Slowly O moved. He gathered his sleeping daughter into his arms and climbed down the ladder one-handed, moving with a careful grace that belied his size and injury. He settled Ryan onto the narrow bed, covering her with the quilt, and stood for a moment, looking down at her. When he turned back to Edith, his expression was complex gratitude and weariness, and something else she could not quite name. "You did not have to do this," he said quietly. "You risk much." "I know," Edith said. "They will come back when they do not find me elsewhere. They will come back and they will suspect." "I know," Edith said again. "Then why?" Edith looked at the small girl sleeping by her fire at the Christmas tree, with its fragile ornaments, at this warrior who had done nothing but seek shelter for his child. She thought of Conrad of Ghost Hollow, of all the lies that men like Kincaid built their empires upon. "Because someone should," she said simply, "and because I know what it means to be hunted by that man." Oka studied her for a long moment. Then very slowly, he nodded. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, for the first time in a very long time, Edith Bower did not feel entirely alone. The blizzard lifted before dawn, leaving the world wrapped in a silence so profound it seemed almost unnatural. The sky cleared to reveal stars like chips of ice scattered across black velvet, and the temperature plummeted so sharply that Edith could hear the cabin logs creaking as they contracted, could see her breath misting white in the air. Despite the fire's warmth, she had not slept. Neither had O. They had taken turns watching the window, listening for the sound of returning riders. But the night had remained still, except for the wind's gradual diminishment. Now, with the first pale hint of dawn touching the eastern horizon, Oiteka rose from his position by the fire and crossed to where his daughter still slept. "We must go," he said quietly before full light. Edith stood wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "Where will you go?" "North into the hills. There are places." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Places where the rock breaks the wind, where we can shelter." "For how long?" Oka did not answer immediately. They both knew the truth. Winter in the northern hills was brutal. A man alone, properly equipped, and with knowledge of the land, might survive it. A man with a child fleeing with nothing but what he could carry had considerably poorer odds. "As long as necessary," he said finally. Edith crossed to her small pantry and began pulling out supplies. Cornbread wrapped in cloth, dried venison, a small sack of beans, a tin of matches, a wool blanket that had been Conrad's. It was not much, barely enough to make a difference, but it was all she could spare without risking her own survival through the remainder of the winter. "I cannot take this," O said as she pressed the bundle into his hands. I need to know that child will not starve." Edith interrupted firmly. "Take it, please." Their eyes met. After a moment, Oka nodded. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but the weight they carried was not. Ryan woke as her father began preparing to leave. She sat up slowly, her eyes moving from Edith to the window to the Christmas tree, as if trying to reconcile what she saw with where she was. Edith crossed to her and knelt. "You are a very brave girl," she said gently. Ryan looked at her with those solemn two-old eyes. "Will they kill my father?" she asked. The directness of it stole Edith's breath. She wanted to lie to offer comfort, but she had learned that children, especially children who had already seen too much, could sense a lie as surely as a dog could sense fear. "I will not let them," Edith said instead. It was not a promise she had any right to make, but she made it anyway. Ryan nodded slowly. Then, surprising both of them, she leaned forward and wrapped her thin arms around Edith's neck in a brief, fierce embrace before pulling away and returning to her father's side. O pulled his buffalo robe tight and lifted the bundle of supplies. He looked at Edith one last time, and she saw gratitude there, and weariness, and something that might have been the beginning of trust. "If you need help," Edith said, "there is a doctor in town, Hugo Mercer. He is a good man. He will not turn you away." Oka nodded. "And if you need help," he replied, "leave a white cloth on your fence post. I will see it." Then they were gone, slipping out into the gray pre-dawn light, two dark figures against the snow that disappeared into the treine within moments. Edith stood in the doorway until she could no longer see them. Then she closed the door and set about erasing all signs of their presence. She swept the floor, scrubbed the basin until no trace of blood remained, rearranged the quilts in the loft. She burned the cloth she had used to bind Oiteka's wound, watching the smoke rise up the chimney and disappear. When she was satisfied that the cabin showed no evidence of visitors, she fed the chickens and hauled water from the creek. Ordinary tasks, normal tasks, the kind of tasks a widow living alone would perform on any morning. But her mind was not on the tasks. It was on what she had learned last night from the brief conversation with Oiteka while Rayan slept. Consincade was not merely hunting a man. He was creating a narrative. The cattle that had gone missing from his ranch had not been stolen, or if they had, it was not by Lakota raiders. O had told her this with quiet certainty. He had been watching Conancade's land for weeks, observing the movements of cattle and men, and he had seen something that made no sense. Herds being driven not away from Conancade's ranch, but deeper into the backcountry of his own property, into hidden canyons where they were being held. Consincade was stealing from himself, creating a false narrative of Lakota raids to justify what the bounty on Oiteka's head. The increased hostility toward the Lakota camp, some darker purpose Edith could not yet discern. She needed to know more. And there was only one way to get that information. She needed to go to town. Cedar Falls was a collection of wooden buildings huddled around a single muddy street that froze solid in winter and became an impassable mere in spring. The general store, the blacksmith's shop, the boarding house, Kate's saloon, the church, the schoolhouse, and Dr. Mercer's office. These comprised the sum total of civilization on this edge of the frontier. Edith walked into town mid-morning, carrying a basket of eggs and a bundle of mending she had completed for Mrs. Hollister, the banker's wife. It was the kind of errand she ran weekly, ordinary and unremarkable, which was precisely why she had chosen it. She stopped first at the general store, where she traded her eggs for flour and coffee. The storekeeper, Mr. Peterson, was a nervous man who spoke little and counted change with trembling fingers. He asked no questions, and Edith volunteered no information. Her next stop was the boarding house, where she delivered the mending to Mrs. Hollister and collected her payment, $3 that went immediately into the small leather pouch Edith wore under her skirt. Only then did she make her way to Dr. Mercer's office. The building was small and drafty, with a waiting room that held 4 chairs and a desk piled with papers and medical journals. The examination room beyond was separated by a curtain that had once been white, but was now the indeterminate gray of much washing. Hugo. Mercer looked up when Edith entered. His face, thin and lined with the evidence of hard years, brightened slightly. "Mrs. Bower," he said, "what brings you here? Are you well?" "Well enough," Edith said. She glanced around to ensure they were alone, then lowered her voice. "I need to speak with you privately." Hugo's expression sharpened. He stood and crossed to the door, checking the street before closing it firmly. Then he gestured for Edith to follow him into the examination room, where he pulled the curtain closed as well. "What has happened?" he asked. Edith told him. Not everything. She did not mention Ohika, and Rayan by name did not specify that they had sheltered in her cabin, but enough. She spoke of the hunt of Kincaid's men, searching her home, of the suspicions that were beginning to form in her mind about the missing cattle. Hugo listened without interruption. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his thigh in a nervous rhythm. "I have been hearing things," he said finally. "From patients, men who work on Kincaid's ranch. They talk when they think I am not listening, or when they are fevered, and their defenses are down." "What do they say?" "That the cattle disappearances are strange, that they happen at odd times in ways that do not match normal rustling patterns, that Kincaid has been secretive about certain parts of his property, restricting access even to his own men." Hugo paused. "And there is something else. Something I have been investigating on my own." He crossed to his desk and pulled out a ledger, not his own, but one that looked official, bound in leather and marked with ink stamps. "A patient gave me this." Hugo said a ranch hand who broke his leg in a fall. He asked me to check his pay records because he suspected Kincaid was shorting him. And when I looked, he opened the ledger and turned it so Edith could see. "Look at these names." Edith's breath caught. She knew some of these names: Conrad Bower, Otto, Johann Schmidt. Men who had died in the Ghost Hollow collapse. Men who had been buried 3 years ago. Yet, according to this ledger, they were still drawing wages month after month, regular as clockwork payments listed beside their names. "Ghost wages," Hugo said quietly. "Kincaid is claiming that these men still work for him, collecting their pay from the investors in Ghost Hollow and pocketing the difference. If he is doing this with the mine payroll, he is doing it elsewhere." Edith finished. "Ranch hands, suppliers, anyone he thinks will not be checked." Hugo nodded grimly. "I have been making a copy of this ledger," he said. "Page by page in secret. It is slow work. I cannot risk being caught, but it is almost complete." "What will you do with it?" "Take it to the U.S. Marshal in Tin Cup. Present it as evidence of fraud. If I can prove Kincaid has been stealing from the Ghost Hollow investors, they will withdraw their support. His empire will collapse." Edith felt a flicker of hope quickly tempered by reality. "Kincaid controls the telegraph office. He controls the mail coach if he suspects you are going to Tin Cup." "I know," Hugo said. "That is why I cannot go openly. I will have to ride out at night, take the back trails, and make it look like I am visiting a patient in another county." He met Edith's eyes. "But if something happens to me, if I do not make it, someone needs to know where the evidence is hidden." "Where?" Edith asked. Hugo turned to his bookshelf and ran his finger along the spines until he found a thick volume Gray's Anatomy. He pulled it down and opened it to the middle. Someone, Hugo himself, Edith realized, had hollowed out the pages, creating a hidden compartment. "When I finish the copy, I will hide it here," Hugo said. "No one would think to look in a medical text. If I do not return from Tin Cup, you will need to retrieve it and find another way to get it to the marshal." "How will I know which book?" Edith asked. Hugo showed her his personal journal, a small leather-bound notebook he kept on his desk. He turned to the last page and wrote a single sentence in his careful script. "The body holds the truth. Consult the gray matter." Edith read it twice, committing it to memory. "Gray matter," she repeated. "Gray's anatomy." "Exactly," Hugo said. He closed the journal and returned it to his desk. "Do not tell anyone else about this." "Not yet. If QRQ can Concade learns what we know." "I understand," Edith said. But even as she spoke, she was thinking of Grace Whitmore, the school teacher, and Kate Brennan, the saloon keeper. If this plan was going to work, if they were going to bring down Harry Kincaid, they would need more than a doctor and a widow. They would need allies who could move through the town, unsuspected, who could listen and observe and gather information. They would need a careful alliance. Edith said slowly, "There are others who might help us. People Kincaid has wronged. If we could bring them together." "No," Hugo said sharply. "Too dangerous. The more people who know, the greater the chance of exposure, or the greater the chance of success," Edith countered. "You cannot ride to Tin Cup alone and unprotected. If King Cad's men find you on the trail, they will kill you and take the evidence, and we will have nothing. But if we have people watching, people ready to act if you do not return." Hugo was silent, his expression torn between fear and hope. "Let me speak to Grace and Kate," Edith said quietly, carefully. "Let me see if they will stand with us." After a long moment, Hugo nodded. "All right," he said. "But carefully, Edith. Very carefully indeed." Over the next week, Edith moved through Cedar Falls like a spider spinning a web, slowly, deliberately connecting thread to thread until a pattern began to emerge. She spoke first to Grace Whitmore visiting the schoolhouse after the children had been dismissed for the day. She found Grace cleaning the slate board, her movements mechanical and tired. "Grace," Edith said, closing the door behind her, "I need your help." Grace turned surprise flickering across her face. "My help with what?" Edith told her. She spoke of the ghost wages of Hugo's plan to ride to Tin Cup, of the need for people who could watch and listen and act if necessary. Grace listened in silence. When Edith finished, she set down the rag she had been using and crossed to the window, looking out at the muddy street. "You are asking me to commit treason against the most powerful man in the territory," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to stand for the truth," Edith replied. Grace was silent for a long moment. Then she turned. "I have a condition," she said. "If we do this, if we bring Consincade down, the Lakota families must be protected. No more bounties, no more hunting. They must be allowed to live in peace." "Agreed," Edith said without hesitation. Grace smiled faintly. "Then I am with you." Kate Brennan required less persuasion. When Edith explained the situation in the back room of the saloon, Kate simply poured 2 glasses of whiskey down hers in a single swallow and said, "When do we start?" "Hugo needs time to finish copying the ledger." Edith said, "A few more days, then he rides for Tynup." "And if he does not make it?" Kate asked. "Then we finish what he started," Edith said. "One way or another." Kate nodded slowly. "I know some men," she said. "Ranch hands who have been cheated by Concade. Cowboys who are tired of taking orders from a man who treats them like animals. If we need muscle, I can get it." "Not yet," Edith said. "Not until we know for certain that we need it. For now, we watch, we listen, and we wait." 3 days later, on a cold morning, when the sky was the color of old pewter, Dr. Hugo Mercer completed his copy of the ledger. He showed it to Edith that afternoon, the pages covered in his cramped handwriting, every name and number meticulously transcribed. "I will leave tomorrow night," he said. "After dark, I will tell the telegraph operator that I am riding to see a patient in the next county, old Mrs. Henderson, who has been ill with pneumonia. It is plausible enough that Concade should not suspect. And the copy? Edith asked. Hugo crossed to the bookshelf and tucked the copied ledger into the hollowed-out Gay's Anatomy. He returned the book to its place, wedged between Materia Medica and Principles of Surgery. If I do not return within 4 days, he said, assume the worst. Take the copy and find a way to get it to Marshall Cross. I do not care how, just get it done. Edith nodded. Be careful, Hugo. He smiled wanly. I have been careful my entire life, Edith. It has not saved me yet. Perhaps it is time to be brave instead. The next evening, just after full dark, Hugo Mercer saddled his horse and rode east out of Cedar Falls. Edith watched from the shadow of the livery stable, her heart tight with worry. Grace stood beside her, silent and tense. He will make it, Grace said quietly. It did not sound like conviction. It sounded like prayer. He must, Edith replied. They watched until Hugo disappeared into the darkness. Then they returned to their homes and waited. 4 days passed. Hugo Mercer did not return. On the 5th day, just after dawn, a rider came into town from the east. He was young, barely 20, and his face was pale with shock. He went directly to the sheriff's office, which was really just a room in the back of the general store, where the part-time deputy, Mr. Carlson, kept a desk and a rifle. And within an hour, the news had spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. Dr. Hugo Mercer was dead. His body had been found in the Snake River, half frozen in the shallows, near a place called Widow's Bend. His horse had been found standing on the bank, resigns trailing. It appeared he had tried to cross the river, the ice had given way, and he had drowned. An accident, a terrible, tragic accident. Edith heard the news from Mr. Peterson at the general store. She stood very still, the sack of flour in her hands, forgotten as the words washed over her. Dead. Hugo was dead. She set the flour down, carefully, paid for her purchases, and walked out into the cold morning air. Her mind was numb, her thoughts sluggish. This could not be happening. Hugo had been careful. Hugo had been smart. Hugo had ridden into a trap. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Concade had known. Somehow Concade had known Hugo was riding to Tin Cup, and he had sent men to intercept him. The ice at Widow's Bend had been solid for weeks, solid enough to bear the weight of wagons crossing. It should not have broken under a single horse and rider, unless someone had broken it first. Edith walked quickly to the schoolhouse. She found Grace standing at the window, her face white, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You heard? Grace said without turning. Yes, it was not an accident. No, Edith agreed. It was murder. Grace turned. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. What do we do? We get the ledger, Edith said. We finish what Hugo started. They waited until evening, when the town had settled into its nightly routines. Then they walked together to Hugo's office. The door was unlocked. No one had thought to secure it yet, and they slipped inside like ghosts. The office was exactly as Hugo had left it. The desk, the examination table, the bookshelf with its rows of medical texts. Edith crossed to the shelf and began scanning the spines, searching for Gray's Anatomy. It was not there. She checked again, running her fingers along each book, pulling out volumes to check behind them. Nothing. The book was gone. It is not here, she said, her voice tight with rising panic. Grace, it is not here. Grace crossed to the desk and began rifling through drawers. The journal, she said. Hugo said he left a clue in his journal. Where is it? They searched for 10 minutes, growing increasingly frantic. The journal was gone too. Someone had been here before them. Someone had known exactly what to look for. Edith sank into Hugo's chair, her mind racing. Who would have known about the ledger? Who would have thought to search the office? The answer came to her with sickening clarity. Pete Garson. Poison Pete. The man who had been watching her cabin, who had studied the pink-tinged water in her basin, who had looked at her with those pale, calculating eyes. If Pete had found Hugo's body, he would have searched the saddlebags. He would have expected to find evidence, a ledger paper, something that explained why the doctor was writing to Tin Cup. And when he did not find it on Hugo's person, he would have come here to search the office. "They have it," Edith said dully. "Kansas men have the ledger." Grace made a sound, half sob, half snarl. "Then we have lost." "No," a voice said from the doorway. Both women spun. Grace let out a small scream before clapping her hand over her mouth. O stood in the doorway, silent as smoke, with Rayen at his side. How long he had been there, how much he had heard. Edith could not guess. "You have not lost," Oka said quietly. "Not yet." "What do you mean?" Edith asked, rising from the chair. "I mean your friend, the doctor. He did not ride to Tin Cup, not directly." Edith's breath caught. "You saw him?" "I followed him." Uka said, "After you told me he might be a friend, I watched his house. I saw him leave that night. I followed to make certain he reached safety." His expression darkened, but he did not go to Tynup. First he rode to the Snake River to Widow's Bend. There is a homestead there, an old trapper cabin abandoned. He went inside. He was there for perhaps half an hour. When he came out, he no longer carried his saddlebags. Edith's mind raced. He hid the ledger. She breathed. Hugo hid the real ledger at the cabin before continuing to Tin Cup. The saddlebags Consincade's men found were empty or filled with decoys. Oiteka nodded. After he left the cabin, he rode for the crossing. That is where they were waiting. 3 men. I saw them from the ridge. They had axes. They had broken the ice beforehand, covered the holes with fresh snow. When the doctor's horse stepped onto the weak ice, it gave way. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "They murdered him." "Yes," Ohiteka said simply. "One of them, a man with a scar. He pulled the body from the river. He searched it. He searched the saddlebags. Then they rode back toward your town." "Pete Garson," Edith said. The name was bitter on her tongue. "He found nothing on Hugo's body, so he came to the office to search here. But he was searching for the wrong thing." "Because the ledger is not here," Grace said, understanding dawning. "It is at the trapper's cabin at Widow's Bend." Edith crossed to Oiteka. "Can you find that cabin again?" "Yes. Will you take us there?" O looked at her for a long moment. "This is dangerous," he said. "Consincade's men may be watching the place. If they see us, they will kill us." Edith finished. "I know, but if we do not retrieve that ledger, Hugo died for nothing. And Kincaid wins." "We cannot let that happen," Grace said quietly. O looked between them. These 2 white women who had chosen to stand against the most powerful man in the territory, who were willing to risk everything for something as ephemeral as justice. And slowly he nodded. "We go tonight," he said, "while the moon is dark." They left Cedar Falls 2 hours after midnight, moving on foot through the frozen darkness. O led the way with Ray, and close at his heels. Edith and Grace followed their breath, misting white in the frigid air, their footsteps crunching softly on the crusted snow. The journey to Widow's Bend took 3 hours. They moved slowly, carefully, avoiding the main trails and keeping to the tree lines where the shadows were deepest. Twice O raised his hand in warning, and they froze as riders passed in the distance. Consincade's men still patrolling, still searching. The trapper's cabin stood in a small clearing near the river, a low structure of logs and sod that looked abandoned even in the darkness. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light showed in the single window. O approached first, moving with the silence of long practice. He circled the cabin once, checking for tracks for signs of recent visitors. Then he gestured for the others to follow. The door hung crooked on leather hinges. Oiteka pushed it open slowly. Inside the cabin was a single room, empty except for a crude table and a rusted stove. The floor was dirt packed hard by years of use. Where would he hide it? Grace whispered. Edith surveyed the space. There were not many options. The table had no drawers. The stove was too obvious. That left the floor, the walls, or her eyes went to the stove again, not inside it. Behind it. She crossed the room and knelt, examining the space between the stove and the wall. The stove had been moved recently, judging by the fresh scratches in the dirt floor. Behind it, the wall logs were loose. Edith worked 2 of the logs free. In the hollow space behind them, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, was a leather-bound ledger. She pulled it out with trembling hands, unwrapped it, opened it. Hugo's handwriting covered the pages, names, dates, payments to men long dead. The entire architecture of Concade's fraud laid bare in cramped, meticulous script. "We have it," Edith breathed. "We have the proof." But even as relief flooded through her, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Hoof beats, multiple horses coming fast. Uka was at the window in an instant. "Riders," he said tersely. "6 of them. They know we are here." "How?" Grace demanded. But Edith already knew. Pete Garson. He must have been watching the office, watching to see if anyone came searching for the ledger. He must have followed them here. "We run." AKA said, "Back to the trees now." They fled out the back of the cabin into the darkness, racing for the tree line 50 yards distant. Behind them, Edith heard shouts, heard horses being spurred to greater speed. They were not going to make it. Oh, must have reached the same conclusion. He thrust Ryan into Edith's arms. "Take her," he said. "Get to the trees. I will hold them." "No," Edith protested. But Oite was already turning his rifle, coming up to his shoulder. The first shot echoed across the clearing. One of the riders went down, clutching his shoulder. The others scattered, seeking cover. "Go," O shouted. Edith ran. She ran with Ray and clutched against her chest, the girl's thin arms locked around her neck. She ran with Grace at her side, and the ledger pressed against her ribs. She ran until her lungs burned, and her legs trembled until the trees swallowed them, and the sound of gunfire became distant and muffled. Only then did she stop gasping and set Ryan down. The girl's face was white with terror, but she did not cry. She simply looked back toward the clearing where her father had stayed behind to buy them time. "He will come," Edith said, though she did not know if it was true. "He will find us." Grace was bent, double hands on her knees, breathing hard. "What do we do now?" she managed. Edith looked down at the ledger in her hands. Hugo had died to protect this. Oh, risking his life to give them time to escape with it. She could not let those sacrifices be meaningless. "We go back to Cedar Falls," she said, "and we make Kincaid answer for what he has done." "How?" Grace asked. "We still cannot reach the marshal. Kincaid controls the telegraph of the mail." "Then we do not send word to the marshal," Edith said. A plan was forming in her mind, desperate and dangerous, but it was all she had. "We bring the proof to the people. We make it public. We force Kincaid to defend himself in front of the entire town." "That is insane," Grace said. "He will have us killed before we get a word out." "Not if we have allies," Edith replied. "Not if we have people willing to stand with us." She thought of Kate Brennan, of the ranch hands Kate had mentioned, of all the people in Cedar Falls who had been wronged by Harry Kincaid, and lacked only the courage or the evidence to speak. "We have the truth," Edith said. "Now we have to make them hear it." From the darkness behind them came a soft whistle. 2 notes low and clear. Ryan's head jerked up. "Papa," she whispered. A moment later, Ohite Tekka materialized from the shadows. His face was grim, and there was a fresh graze along his cheekbone, but he was alive. "They are regrouping," he said. "We have perhaps an hour before they organize a proper search. We must move back to Cedar Falls," Edith said. "We are going to end this." O looked at Grace at the ledger. Edith clutched like a talisman. Then he nodded. "Then we go together," he said. They reached Cedar Falls just as dawn was breaking 4 exhausted figures, moving through the gray light like revenants risen from some forgotten grave. Edith's feet were numb in her boots, her hands cramped from clutching the ledger. But she did not slow. They went first to Kate's saloon, entering through the back door that Kate kept unlocked for special circumstances. They found her already awake, sitting at a table in the back room, with a pot of coffee and a rifle across her knees. "I heard the shots," Kate said without preamble. "Figured it was either you coming back, or King Cad's men coming to finish the job. Thought I should be ready for either." "It's us," Edith said. She set the ledger on the table. "We have the proof, Hugo's copy of King Cade's fraudulent records. Every ghost wage, every false payment, every lie he has built his empire on." Kate picked up the ledger and flipped through it, her expression hardening with each page. "This is enough to hang him," she said quietly. "If we can get it to someone who matters. We cannot. Grace said Concade controls all communication out of town. Then we do not send it out. Edith said we use it here today." Now Kate looked up sharply. "What are you proposing?" "I am proposing we gather every person in Cedar Falls who has been wronged by Harry Concade," Edith said. "Every ranch hand he has cheated every widow. He has defrauded every merchant he has squeezed. We bring them together. We show them the proof, and we march to Kincaid's ranch and demand he answer for his crimes. That is not a plan." Kate said, "That is a lynch mob." "No," Edith said. "It is justice long overdue." Kate studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "I know some men, good men who have been waiting for someone to stand up to Concade. Give me 2 hours. I will gather them here." While Kate went to recruit allies, Edith, Grace, and O remained in the back room, taking turns resting and watching the street. Ryan curled up in a corner, finally succumbing to exhaustion, her small body going limp with sleep. Edith stood at the window watching the town come to life. Shopkeepers opening their doors, women hanging laundry despite the cold, children running in the street, their breath misting white. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that today might change everything. Oika came to stand beside her. They did not speak for a long time. Finally, Edith said quietly, "After this is over, if we survive it, what will you do?" "Find a place where my daughter can be safe," Oka replied. "Somewhere far from men like Kincaid." "Such places do not exist," Edith said. "No," Oka agreed. "But we look anyway, because the alternative is to stop looking," and that he shook his head. "That is how they win." Edith looked at him, at this man who had every reason to hate her people, to walk away and let them tear themselves apart, but who had chosen instead to stand with her, and felt something shift in her chest. Not gratitude, though there was that something deeper, something that felt like recognition. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying, for helping." Oika's dark eyes met hers. "You gave my daughter wonder," he said, "when all she had known for so long was fear. That is a debt I cannot repay, but I can stand with you, so I will." The moment stretched between them, weighted with all the things that could not yet be said, with the awareness that they were two people from different worlds who had found common ground in the most unlikely of places. Then Grace called softly from the doorway, "They are coming," and the moment broke. Over the next 2 hours, Kate's back room filled with people. There was Sven Bjornsson, the blacksmith, whose wife had died in childbirth after Dr. Mercer had been unable to attend because Cade had demanded he treat an injured horse instead. There was Billy Hutchkins, the young ranch hand, who had searched Edith's cabin, but who had grown increasingly disgusted by Cade's cruelty. There were 3 other cowboys, weathered men with hard eyes, who had been shorted on wages one too many times. There was Mary Preston, a widow like Edith, whose husband had died in the Ghost Hollow collapse. There was even Reverend Talbot, the circuit preacher, who spoke quietly about the sin of bearing false witness. 12 people in all, 13 counting Oha, though some of the cowboys looked uneasy when they realized a Lakota warrior was among their number. Edith stood before them and told the truth. She told them about Hugo's investigation, about the ghost wages, about the murder at Widow's Bend. She showed them the ledger, reading aloud the names of dead men still drawing pay. Conrad Bauer, Otto, Samuel Yates, Johann Schmidt. Men these people had known, had worked beside, had mourned. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Billy Hutchkins spoke. "What do you want us to do?" he asked. "I want you to come with us to Cade's ranch," Edith said. "I want you to stand witness while we present this evidence to him. I want you to be ready to testify when the law finally comes. And I want you to protect us if Cade tries to silence us the way he silenced Hugo Mercer. That is asking us to risk our lives." Sven said it was not an accusation, merely a statement of fact. "Yes," Edith said, "I know." The silence stretched again. Then Mary Preston stood. "My husband died because Harry Cade cut corners and lied about it," she said quietly. "If there is a chance, even a small chance, to make him answer for that, then I will take it." One by one, the others stood. Billy, Sven, the cowboys, even Reverend Talbot, who looked profoundly uncomfortable but resolute. "Then we go," Kate said. "Now before word reaches Cade that we are gathering." They filed out of the saloon, a strange and ragtag procession. Edith carried the ledger. Uka carried his rifle. Kate carried her shotgun. Grace walked with her head high, her schoolteacher's posture straight, despite the fear Edith knew she must be feeling. Behind them came the others, the blacksmith, the cowboys, the widow, the preacher. An army of the wronged marching toward their reckoning. The Cade Ranch sat 3 miles north of town, a sprawling complex of corral and outbuildings dominated by a large main house built of logs and fieldstone. Smoke rose from its chimneys. Horses moved in the corral. Men ranch hands paused in their work to watch as the procession approached. Harry Cade emerged from the main house as they entered the yard. He wore a heavy coat and a broad-brimmed hat, and his face showed more annoyance than concern. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the yard. "Mrs. Bower, have you taken to leading mobs now?" "Not a mob," Edith called back. "Witnesses." She walked forward until she stood 20 ft from Cade. The others fanned out behind her in a loose semicircle. O stood at her right shoulder. Kate stood at her left, her shotgun held casually but ready. "Witnesses to what Cade asked to your crimes," Edith said. She held up the ledger. "This is a record of every false payment you have made to Ghost Hollow investors, every ghost wage paid to dead men, every dollar you have stolen through fraud and deception." Cade's expression did not change, but Edith saw his eyes flick to the ledger, then to the people behind her, calculating odds and outcomes. "That is slander," he said flatly. "I will have you arrested." "On what charge?" Edith interrupted. "Speaking the truth. Shall I read the names aloud?" Shall I tell your men here how you have been stealing from the investors who pay their wages? How you have been pocketing money meant for widows and orphans?" A murmur ran through the ranch hands who had gathered to watch. Consincade's jaw tightened. "Where did you get that book?" he asked quietly. "From Dr. Hugo Mercer," Edith said, "before your men murdered him at Widow's Bend." The murmur grew louder. Consincade's hand moved toward the revolver at his hip. "Careful, Harry," Kate said, her voice lazy, but her shotgun suddenly pointed at his chest. "You draw that pistol, and this gets very messy, very fast." Concade froze. His eyes swept the assembled group, and for the first time, Edith saw something that might have been fear flicker across his face. "Pete," he called. "Garson, get out here." The door to the bunkhouse opened, and Poison Pete emerged, along with 3 other hard-eyed men Edith recognized as the bounty hunters who had been searching for. Oh, they were armed, and they moved with the casual confidence of men accustomed to violence. "These people are trespassing," Cade said. "Remove them." Pete's hand went to his revolver, but before he could draw, Billy Hutchkins stepped forward. "Pete," Billy said quietly. "Don't." Pete's eyes flicked to the young cowhand. "You picking sides, Billy?" "I am picking the truth," Billy said. "I have been working this ranch for 3 years. I have seen the things Mr. Consincade does, the way he treats people, the way he lies." He looked at the other ranch hands. "You have all seen it too. Are we going to keep pretending we have not?" A long silence. Then one of the older hands, a grizzled man named Tom Sawyer, spat into the dirt and stepped forward to stand beside Billy. "Kid's right," Tom said. "I'm tired of looking the other way." 2 more hands joined them, then another. Within moments, half of Concade's own workforce had aligned themselves with Edith's group. Pete looked at Consincade, waiting for orders. But QRQ was staring at his men, at the open rebellion on their faces, and the calculation in his eyes had shifted to something colder and more desperate. "You are all fired," he said flatly. "Get off my land." "It is not your land much longer," Grace said, speaking for the first time. "When the U.S. Marshal sees that ledger, you will lose everything. The ranch, the mine investments, all of it. You will be lucky if you only go to prison." Consincade's face twisted. "You stupid women," he snarled. "You think you can destroy me? I own this valley. I own the telegraph office, the mail routes, every line of communication in or out of Cedar Falls. You cannot reach the Marshal. You cannot." "Actually," a new voice said, calm and authoritative, "they already have." Everyone turned. A man stepped out from behind one of the outbuildings, a tall figure in a long coat with a tin star pinned to his vest. His face was weathered and hard, his eyes the color of winter sky. U.S. Marshal Nehemiah Cross. Edith's breath caught. "How?" "Mrs. Brennan sent a rider 3 days ago," Cross said, nodding to Kate. "Young fellow used to work as a scout. He knew the back trails, the ones your telegraph operator does not watch. Mr. Consincade, he reached Tin Cup with Mrs. Brennan's message about Dr. Mercer's investigation, and I came as fast as I could." He crossed the yard, his boots crunching on frozen ground. "I have been watching this ranch for 2 days now, gathering evidence, and what I have seen combined with what Mrs. Bower has in that ledger is more than enough to place you under arrest." Consincade took a step back. "You have no authority." "I have all the authority I need," Cross said. "Harry Consincade, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you will want to talk to a lawyer. A good one." For a moment, Edith thought Kincaid might resist. His hand twitched toward his gun. Pete Garson shifted his weight clearly, considering his options. Then Kate cocked her shotgun, the sound impossibly loud in the tense silence, and Pete's hands very slowly moved away from his weapons. Smart choice, Kate said. Marshal Cross produced a set of iron manacles and snapped them around Consincade's wrists. The metallic click of the locks closing sounded like finality, like justice, like an ending 3 years in the making. Consincade looked at Edith, and there was something ugly in his eyes, hatred and disbelief in equal measure. "You have destroyed me," he said quietly. "No," Edith replied. "You destroyed yourself. I simply made sure everyone knew it." Cross led Concade toward his horse. Pete Garson and the other bounty hunters were also placed in restraints, accessories to murder, Cross said, for their role in Hugo Mercer's death. As the prisoners were mounted on horses and prepared for the journey to Tin Cup, Cross turned to Edith. "You took a considerable risk," he said, confronting him here in the open with only a handful of allies. "If I had not been watching, if Mrs. Brennan's rider had not reached me in time, this could have ended very badly." "I know," Edith said, "but we could not wait." Every day Concade remained free was another day he could hurt someone else. Cross nodded slowly. "For what it is worth," he said, "you did well, all of you." His gaze moved to Oha, standing silent and watchful at the edge of the group. "I will see to it that the bounty on your head is rescinded. You are a free man, Oka, of the Lakota, as are your people." O inclined his head in acknowledgement, but said nothing. Cross swung into his saddle. "There will be a trial in Tinup," he said. "I will need you all to testify. Can you do that?" "Yes," Edith said. Grace and Kate nodded in agreement. "Good." Cross touched the brim of his hat. "I will be in touch. In the meantime, Mrs. Bower, you should know the homestead you live on, the debt Consincade claimed your husband owed. According to these records, it was entirely fabricated. The land is yours, free and clear. I will make certain the paperwork reflects that." Edith felt something crack open in her chest. Not grief this time, but relief so profound it was almost painful. "Thank you," she managed. Cross nodded once more, then spurred his horse into motion. The column of prisoners, Kincaid Pete and the others, followed, their heads low, their futures irrevocably changed. As they rode away, the yard erupted into conversation. The ranch hands who had stood with Edith were clapping each other on the back, grinning with the fierce joy of men who had found their courage and survived. Kate was laughing her shotgun over her shoulder. Grace was crying quietly, her face pressed against Mary Preston's shoulder. Edith stood apart from them, all watching the riders disappear into the distance. She felt, Tekka come to stand beside her. "It is done," he said quietly. "Yes," Edith agreed. "It is done." But even as she said it, she knew it was not quite true. Consincade would stand trial. There would be testimony, cross-examination, the slow machinery of justice grinding toward its conclusion. And after that, there would be the long, difficult work of rebuilding, of learning to live in a world where the man who had cast such a long shadow over Cedar Falls was finally gone. "What will you do now?" Edith asked. O was silent for a moment. "My people are camped north of here," he said. "They will want to know what has happened. I will go to them, tell them that the bounty has been lifted, that they can live without fear." He paused. And then, Edith prompted. "And then I will see." "Oh," Hika said, "perhaps we will go north as I planned. Or perhaps," his eyes met hers, "perhaps we will stay, if there is a place for us here." Edith felt her breath catch. "There is," she said quietly. "There's always a place." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Rayan appeared at her father's side, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and the moment passed. But it did not disappear. It remained a promise unspoken of future, waiting to be built. The trial of Harry Consincade took place in Tin Cup, 3 weeks later, the territorial courtroom was packed with spectators, townspeople from Cedar Falls who had made the 2-day journey, journalists from as far away as Denver, and a host of curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle of a powerful man brought low. Edith testified first. She stood in the witness box with Hugo Mercer's ledger in her hands and read from it in a clear, steady voice. Name after name, payment after payment, the entire architecture of Concade's fraud laid bare for judge and jury to see. Grace testified about the conditions at Ghost Hollow, about the reports of unsafe practices that had been ignored. Kate testified about the conversations she had overheard in her saloon ranch hands, complaining about shorted wages, bounty hunters boasting about the men they had hunted. O testified about what he had witnessed at Widow's Bend, the broken ice, the ambush, the murder of Hugo Mercer. His testimony was damning, and the defense attorney's attempts to discredit him as a hostile savage backfired spectacularly when Marshall Cross took the stand and confirmed every detail of Oteka's account. The trial lasted 4 days. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. Harry Consincade was sentenced to 25 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. Pete Garson and the other bounty hunters received 10 years each. When the verdict was read, Consincade did not react. He simply stared straight ahead, his face carved from stone, as the judge pronounced sentence. But as he was led from the courtroom in chains, he looked directly at Edith. She met his gaze and did not flinch. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Falls began to change. The ghost wages were tallied and distributed to the families of the dead miners. Edith received a substantial sum, enough to repair her cabin, buy livestock, and plant a proper garden come spring. Mary Preston and the other widows received similar payments. The ranch hands who had been cheated were given back wages. Some stayed on at what had been Consincade's ranch, now managed by a cooperative of workers. Others moved on, seeking opportunities elsewhere. The bounty on Oteka was officially rescinded by Marshall Cross. The Lakota winter camp on the Snake River was left in peace. Some of the families moved north, seeking distance from the painful memories of Consincade's persecution. But a few stayed, including Oteka and Ryan. They built a small cabin on the creek 1/2 mile from Edith's homestead. It was close enough for mutual protection, far enough for independence. Oh, hunted and trapped. Ryan began attending Grace's school, though the first few weeks were difficult as she learned English and adjusted to the strange customs of the white children. Edith visited often, bringing food, helping with tasks, and slowly, very slowly, learning to understand this man who had appeared in her doorway on a blizzard-racked Christmas Eve and changed the course of her life. They spoke little of the past, but they spoke of the future, of crops and weather, of Rain's education, of the gossip from town. Small things, normal things, the building blocks of something that might in time become more than mere alliance. One afternoon in early spring, as Edith helped Ryan with her reading lessons, while Oka repaired the cabin's roof, Grace appeared with news. "Marshall Cross has appointed a new deputy for Cedar Falls," she said. "Someone local, someone who understands the territory. He has asked if Billy Hutchkins would accept the position." Billy. Edith blinked in surprise. "He is barely 20 years old." 22, Grace corrected. "And he has integrity, which is more than the last deputy had. He has accepted Cedar Falls will have real law now, not Consincade's law." It was a small thing, but small things, Edith had learned, were how you rebuilt a world. The winter of 1875 came hard and cold, but it did not bring the same fear that previous winters had carried. Edith stood in her cabin on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year since Oteka and Ryan had appeared at her door and prepared for guests. The cabin was warm. The fire crackled in the hearth, and in the corner stood the same small pine tree, decorated once again with dried oranges and cranberries and Conrad's carved birds. But this year, there were new ornaments as well. Ryan had made them small figures, woven from prairie grass, shaped into animals and stars. Ohiteka had carved 3 additional birds to join Conrad's 3, and they perched on the branches together, a family of 6, each one distinct, each one part of the whole. A knock came at the door. Edith opened it to find and Ryan standing on her threshold snow, dusting their hair just as it had 1 year ago. But this time there was no fear in their eyes, no desperation, just warmth and anticipation. "Come in," Edith said, stepping back, "quickly before you freeze." They entered, and Ryan immediately ran to the tree, her face lighting up with the same wonder Edith remembered from that first night. But now, instead of tentative touching, she reached out confidently and adjusted one of the grass ornaments that had gone askew. "There," she said, satisfied. "Now it is perfect." More knocks followed. Grace arrived, bringing bread and honey. Kate came with a bottle of wine she swore was for medicinal purposes only. Billy Hutchkins arrived with Sven Bjornson and Tom Sawyer, the grizzled ranch hand, who had been one of the first to stand up to Kincaid. They crowded into the small cabin, filling it with voices and laughter and the smell of food and coffee. They ate together a strange, cobbled-together family of misfits and survivors, and told stories of the year that had passed. As the evening wore on and the others began to leave, drifting back to their own homes through the cold and dark, only Tekka and Ryan remained. Ryan had fallen asleep by the fire, her head pillowed on her arm. Sat beside her, watching her with the same fierce protectiveness Edith had seen that first night. Edith came to sit across from him. Between them, the fire crackled and hissed. Outside, the winter wind sang its old familiar song. 1 year, Oka said quietly. "It seems both longer and shorter than it should." "Yes," Edith agreed. "When I came to your door that night," Uka continued, "I did not think we would survive the week. I thought Consincade's men would find us, or the cold would take us, or he trailed off, shaking his head. I did not think we would be here like this." "Neither did I," Edith admitted. "I thought I was condemning myself to death by opening that door, but I could not turn you away. Not after I saw Rayanne's face when she looked at the tree." Smiled faintly. "She still speaks of that first night. She says it was the moment she remembered that beautiful things exist, that not everything in the world is hard and cold and cruel." "She is wise, your daughter," Edith said. "She has had to be," Oka replied. His expression sobered. "Too many of our children have had to be wise too soon, have had to see things no child should see." He looked at Edith. "But perhaps that is changing slowly because of what you did, what we did. It is not finished." Edith said, "There will be others like Canoncade. There will always be men who seek power by crushing those beneath them." "Yes," Hitika agreed. "But now there are also people who will stand against them. That is what we built this year, Edith. Not justice for what was done to us, but a foundation for the future, a foundation for children like Ryan to stand on." Edith felt something tighten in her chest. She looked at this man, this warrior, this father, this ally who had become something more, without either of them quite naming what that something was, and saw in his eyes a reflection of her own hope and fear and cautious, fragile optimism. "Will you stay?" she asked quietly. "Here in Cedar Falls, or will you go north as you once planned?" Tekka did not answer immediately. He looked at his sleeping daughter, at the glowing tree, at Edith herself. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful, as if he were testing the weight of the words before releasing them. "I think," he said, "that we have already found the place we were searching for." Edith's breath caught. Are you certain the people here, not all of them, have changed? There will still be those who look at you and see only an enemy. I know, Ohite said, but there are also those who look at us and see allies, see friends, see... He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. See family. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and promise. Yes, Edith said softly. Family. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the fire burn down to embers. Finally, Oiti arose and gently lifted his sleeping daughter into his arms. He carried her to the door, then paused and looked back. Thank you, he said, for opening the door 1 year ago tonight. Thank you, Edith replied, for knocking. He smiled, a real smile, this time warm and genuine, and stepped out into the night. Edith closed the door behind him and stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the rough wood. Then she turned and looked at her cabin, at the tree Conrad had loved now, shared with ornaments from Rayon's hands, at the fire that had warmed 4 different people tonight, at the life she had somehow managed to build from the ruins of grief and injustice. On the small table by the window lay a letter. It had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by Marshal Cross himself. It was from the territorial governor's office, and it officially cleared Conrad's name. The investigation into the Ghost Hollow collapse had been reopened in the wake of Conancade's trial, and the new findings were unambiguous. Sabotage had not caused the collapse. Conancade's cost-cutting measures, the removed supports, and the ignored safety warnings had been the sole cause. Conrad had been right. He had tried to stop it. He had written letters, filed complaints, warned anyone who would listen, and he had been silenced for it. But he had not been forgotten. Edith picked up the letter and read it once more, her eyes tracing the official language that finally gave her husband the vindication he deserved. "We did it, Conrad," she whispered. "We made them hear the truth." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept Conrad's few remaining possessions, his pocket watch, his whittling knife, the letters he had written to her from the mine. Artifacts of a life cut short, but not meaningless, never meaningless. She returned to the fire and sat down in the chair Conrad had built, looking at the Christmas tree and thinking of all the ghosts and dreams and promises that hung from its branches. 1 year ago she had been alone. Now she was part of something larger, a community of the wounded and the brave, of those who had looked into the face of injustice and refused to turn away. It was not a perfect world. It was not even a safe one. But it was a world where doors could be opened, where strangers could become family, and where Christmas trees could glow with the light of both memory and hope. Outside, the winter wind howled, but